Our lost project for this semester is going to be inspired by the book A Crack at the Edge of the World, America and the Great California Earthquake of 1906 by Simon Winchester. Simon Winchester is a historian, but he's also really versed in geology and natural history, and he's written a number of books looking at the intersection of usually massive, tragic environmental events like Krakatoa erupting, or in this case, the 1906 earthquake, and then looking at how that ripples out into the complexities of the societies around them. So San Francisco in 1906 was an incredibly diverse but also socially complex place, and the inequities that existed in San Francisco at that time were really sort of illuminated and exacerbated by the devastating effects of the earthquake, but also the fire that resulted afterwards. So it's a fascinating read, even if you're not really that interested in history. It's kind of a page turner. So I highly recommend this if you're looking for some not exactly light reading, but if you want a really riveting history. Simon Winchester's works are great, and I highly recommend this one. Anyway, so let's take a look at what we have in this file. So I've downloaded several public domain files. One thing to be aware of in working in future projects is that if you're working with historic imagery, especially if it's from the turn of the century or earlier, very often it's in the public domain, but you do want to be careful and double check. Now, most photographs, videos, and sound recordings taken by representatives of the U.S. government or by officials who document things for the U.S. government are in the public domain. So if you go to archives.gov, these are the United States archives, and you can see that it already breaks it down into different categories, but you can search for example, 1906 earthquake photo, and it'll give you a whole host of different possibilities for searching. Most of these are hosted at archives.gov, but occasionally they're also co-hosted by local governments. And then you can go down and you can find all kinds of just astounding images. So this is one of the ones that we're using. This will be our background image, and it tells us some information about it. So these are souvenir hunters, supposedly from the early stages right after the earthquake and fire. And if we go to view in National Archives catalog, there we can access a higher resolution version of it. But even more important, we can get copyright information. So the creator was sent to the US Senate, so we really don't know who the original photographer was in this case. Often we do though. And it gives us the date of it. And it also tells us about access restrictions or copyright issues. All right, so we're going to make a composition that's going to look a little like something like this. I haven't finished masking out the areas yet, but we're going to go over how to assemble this again since it's been a little while since we've worked with Photoshop. So first, we're going to go to File and make a new file, and we're going to set it to HD TV 1080p, which is 1920 by 1080 and 72 ppi. Now we're going to bring in our graphics. So we'll go to that folder, and there's the graphics folder, and we have three different images we're going to be bringing in. First, we're going to bring in the background image, which is this earthquake. So I'm just going to go ahead and drag it from my Finder window over my image, and you'll see that it comes in really small, and that's fine. So I'll hit return. And what we can do is we can reset the smart object to its default size. So if you control click on the name of that layer, and then go down to reset transform, it'll set it to its native resolution in relation to the 72 ppi image. So we just want it to be as big as it can get without going any bigger than its native resolution. And we're going to sort of move this around so that it's a little bit sort of like this. We might do a little bit of a pan later on. We'll come back to that. So that's our background image. All right, I'm going to go ahead and double click on this background and delete it because we won't need that layer. And then let's rename this background. All right, so let's go ahead and save this to that graphics folder. So there it is, and you'll call it your last name 1906, and then say save. All right, so now we're going to repeat that process with the next image, which is this woman and children. So we'll drag this in and hit return. Then we'll control click or right click on that layer, go to reset transform, and then I'll move this over, whoops, about to there. All right. And what we're going to do, actually, maybe I'll move this over for a second, is we're going to go ahead and do a rough masking of this image. So to mask this, we'll click on this icon here to be the mask, and we'll grab our brush tool, so B for brush. I'm holding down the Control and Option key to reset the size of this and scale. And then I'm going to toggle my black and my white. And I just updated Photoshop and I've already found a bug. Normally you can see the red interior of this, so that's a little annoying, but that's okay. So I'm just going to do a really rough masking of that background area. And we'll come back in and sort of clean that up later. I'm going to make sure there's not anything else at the top. Just go ahead and hit delete. Whoops, other way. Here we go. There. All right. So now she's going to be sort of in this mid scene here. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that bottom part too. So let's grab my marquee, hit delete. There we go. All right. And I'll just put that about right there. So she's going to be a little bit in the foreground. And now we'll go ahead and bring in that last image. And we'll drag this in. Hit return. And then same thing. Right click and reset transform. Now, in his case, I do need to make him a little bit bigger. I am going to upsample him. Fortunately, this whole image is so grainy and blurry, it's probably going to be fine. So I'm going to go ahead first and mask him. Whoops. So I need to make that mask. And then I'm going to go ahead and just mask out around him. Just really roughly. And I want to keep some of those boulders and stuff, so I'm going to go ahead and move this up a little bit. And I will mask this. There we go, about like that. And that's about where I want that to end. All right, so then I'll go ahead and toggle my black and my white with my eraser. And I just want these sort of foreground boulders to stay there. I'll do a more precise cleaning up later on. There we go. And now that I have that roughly positioned, I'm going to go ahead and upsample him. So normally you don't scale things bigger than they should be, but again, because this image is so grainy and blurry, I probably can get away with it. So what I need to do is make sure he's big enough so that it's clear he's a foreground figure. And it's going to be tricky because this guy is a foreground figure, so I'm going to need to sort of make him in between, basically. Something like that. There we go. All right, so there's some that rubble. So he's going to be behind this guy in the corner, but in front of this woman and her children. All right, so there's our rough masking. Next, we're going to clean this up a little bit more precisely. Okay, this background image is going to set the value and kind of tone for the rest of the imagery for the animation. So I'm going to go ahead and rasterize this layer. So I right click on it, and this is just the background layer, and I say rasterize layer. So now it's no longer a smart object. And I have my other two layers hidden for the time being. Next, I'm going to expand the sky area so that I can do a little bit of a pan downwards. So to do this, I need to expand my canvas area, but I want to do this uniformly, and I want to make sure that I go back to 1920 by 1080. So I'm going to go to Image, Canvas Size, and I'll change this from inches to pixels. So 1920 by 1080 is a standard video size, so we need to make sure we go back to that. But for now, I'm going to change this to 2000 by 2000. Actually, I'll make this 2400 by 2000. And then I'll say OK. And there we can see the rest of that sky. Now I am going to make a destructive change. Normally you don't want to do destructive changes, but I'm really just going to be getting rid of this very, very top part of the white right there. So I'm going to go ahead and select that, hit delete. And now it's just going to end that sort of beige. Now that beige, you can see that's part of that's the photographic edge, but that's okay. We'll make that work. Next, I'm going to grab the top part of this image, right before those buildings start. So I just want to make sure that I'm above that background building and probably above this building too. That one doesn't actually quite matter as much since it's going to be off screen, but just in case I have some area there that I want to make sure I grab that. So there's that. And what I can do is I can extend this upwards. So I'll go to Edit, Content Aware Scale, and then you can see that it snaps to that top part. So I'm going to grab this middle anchor point, and I'm going to hold down the Shift key, and this way I can just scale it in one direction. So I'm just going to scale this up quite a bit, something like that. There we go. So now I have plenty of sky to scale from, and you can see if we zoom in on that, it's a grainy enough image. We can see those pixels are getting a little distorted, but it'll be fine for what we're doing. All right, so now I need to make sure that I set this back to that original image. So I'll go to Image, Canvas Size. I'll change this back to pixels again. And then I change this back to 1920 by 1080. So exactly 1920 by 1080. I'll say OK. I'll say Proceed. And there's that image now that it's cropped back down to this. And you can see when I did that, it didn't delete anything. So you want to check that to make sure. So I can do a nice little pan down. So if I start here, then I can pan down and end on those other images. Now the next thing I want to do is get rid of the signature here on the photograph. So I'll zoom in. I'll make a new layer. I'll grab the clone stamp. And I'm just going to do a series of selective clones. Now, of course, this is really annoying that I can't see my image anymore. I'll try to go back and see if there's a setting I can change for that. But I'm going to go ahead and sample nearby. And I'm going to make sure this is set to current and below up here. So current and below. So now I'll go ahead and sample. And now it's showing me the inside of that. That was kind of weird. I'm going to make sure that it's pretty blurry. There we go. And I'm just going to make some small samples. Now, the trick to the clone stamp is you want to sample a lot. So don't just sample once and hope for the best. You do want to sample multiple times. So you want to try to make sure that that sampling matches the area that you're looking at. Now, I want this to be in the same layer as that background. So I'll go ahead and select both those layers and click on the folder icon here, and this will make a folder, and I'll call this background. Now, this is for my non-destructive changes. Before I bring this whole image into After Effects, whoops, that didn't work because I have auto select turned on, so I need to turn off auto select, and then I can grab that whole folder and move it. So I want to make sure that that whole image is moved over. And before I bring this into After Effects, I'm going to merge this group. So I'm going to make a destructive change, but it'll be a different version. Now I can see that there's one more spot where I need to do some clone stamping. So I'll go back to that clone layer, and I can actually rename this clone stamp. And I'll zoom in on this guy. So now I have that done. The last thing I want to do is I want to decide if I want to change the color of this or the value of this. This actually has some pretty good value to it also already. There's nice light colors and then a good sense of dark colors. So I'm actually not going to make any kind of change to this. Next, I'm going to bring up this image, and I'm going to move her up so I can kind of see that whole image in relation to this background. And you can see that she's quite a bit more washed out than the background. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and make a new adjustment layer for levels. And I'll go ahead and try a couple different things. I might end up using hue and saturation instead, but I'll try levels first. Now when I add this levels, I need to make sure it's a clipping mask so that it's only affecting the layer below it. So I'll do that. It's a clipping mask now. And first I'll try to bring in the darks to try to see if I can match the darks in that other image. And I'll bring up the lights. And I don't want those lights to be any brighter than that sky. So I can't really bring it up that much. I can play around with the midtones to try to make the midtones a little bit darker. And that almost works. So it's a pretty dark image. There we go. So that works pretty well. Now, when we do that, we can see this is quite a bit warmer toned and quite a bit more saturated than this background image. So even though we have the values pretty close, the color is a little bit off. So now I'm going to go ahead and add a hue and saturation. Again, I'll make this a clipping mask so that it's only affecting the layer below it. And I'll try pulling down the saturation, but it makes it it's a little bit too warm. So I'm gonna actually make this a little bit cooler, just a tiny bit cooler. And now I'll go ahead and bring that saturation down. So I'm trying to kind of match the color of the lightest areas of this with that sky. And that's pretty close. Let's see how far. So that's too far. So I do need a little bit of color in there. All right, and once I do that, I might need to go back to the levels and adjust them a bit more. So now I can actually bring up that brightness a little bit. All right, and that's pretty close. Try to see if I can bring it up even more. So there's a little bit of a back and forth between the levels and then the hue and saturation. I'm going to bring that hue and saturation down just a little bit more. There we go. All right, so that's pretty good. It's okay. I'll live with it. All right, so next we're going to do the same thing for the next one. So I'm going to go ahead and actually put this hue, levels, and this background image in a folder together. And I'll go ahead and call this folder Woman and Children. And I'll go ahead and shy that for a minute. And now I'm going to do the same thing with this guy. Now I've already scaled him up, so he's quite a bit bigger. And in his case, it's almost a little bit the opposite problem. He's almost too bright. So I'm going to go ahead to levels again. And again, I'm going to make this an adjustment layer. And you can move this over so that you can kind of see your image at the same time. Whoops. I wanted to put that there. There we go. All right. And then I'm going to close this tab group. And then pull this down. There we go. Okay, so you can move tabs around so that you can kind of see what you're working on. So in his case, he's like actually much too bright. So I'm going to go ahead and play around with this gray scaling to see if I can try to make him a little bit less saturated. And what I might actually need to do is pull down the output of that light area. So I'm going to pull this down a little bit. And I'm trying to match this brightness with the brightness in the sky. So it's much harder to make things, if things are already overexposed, or not overexposed, but if they're higher contrast than your source image, it's much harder to match them than going the other way around. I could try to adjust those output levels, just sort of flatten out the whole value, and then kind of recalibrate it. But I'll keep pulling down that bright tone just a little bit. All right. So this will be a hard one, but that's okay. And then I'll go ahead and play around with those midtones a little bit to see if I can get this to match that sky a little bit better. Now I'll go back and bring that contrast back up a little bit. All right, well, maybe about like that. So fortunately for me, the brightest thing in this image are going to be those rocks because he's going to be masked out. So the next thing I need to do is actually make him a little bit warmer. So I'll go to hue and saturation. Again, I'll make this a clipping mask. And I'll go ahead and just pull up the saturation quite a lot on him just to see what I can get. And you can see I don't really get much of anything. All right, so what I can do is then set this to colorize. And there you can see it's much too orange. So I'll go ahead, or red, I'll go ahead and make it like a little bit of an orangish color. And then I'll pull down that saturation so that it has a little bit of a color cast to it. So if I turn this on and off, you can kind of see the difference. And that's pretty close. Maybe a little bit lighter. There we go. So sometimes it helps to just turn it on and off to see what looks too blue or what looks too orange, and that's about right. So I'll go ahead then and put this guy in a folder together. And I'll call this man. All right. So now we have these sort of three groups together, and I'll go ahead and get started with the masking. So with the masking, I'm going to speed this up so you don't have to sit there and watch me do it, but first I'm going to save this. And then I'm going to mask this entire group. So I don't need to just mask just that one layer. I can do the whole folder altogether. So I'll go ahead and put a mask on that entire folder, and then I'll come in. And actually, let me scroll this over because I don't really need that much space now. There we go. And when you're masking things, sometimes it helps to sort of figure out, okay, what's the best technique? So you can use something like the quick selection tool to try to figure out how to mask certain areas to see what's going to give you the best results. Sometimes this works great. Sometimes you still have to go back in and do a certain amount of work. So I'll go ahead and toggle my black and my white by hitting X, and then I'll just keep coming through. I'll deselect that, and I'll see if I can select some more. I'll hold down the Option key. But at a certain point, I'm probably going to have to come in and do more precise masking. So I'll just go ahead and speed this up now. Okay, so I did some quick masking to that. Typically, when I'm masking things, if they're not going to be animated too much, like if I'm not worrying about moving this around, I can be really rough with things. In this case, I just want to make sure I have a little bit more of a precise masking. So I'll turn off that background and then I'll keep masking. By the time you get into fine masking like this is really when you want to make sure that you have your Wacom tablet or pressure sensitive pen tablet plugged in. So if I hold down the Option Shift key, I'm just going to go ahead and mask into this so you can see. But as I'm pressing down more gently or harder, I'm varying that line width. If you're not getting that, make sure that this radial button is checked right there. Just like with drawing, you want to use this tool with the masking. Now, I'm also going to make it a little bit softer because this picture is pretty blurry. So you don't need to be more precise than the image is. But now I go ahead and I keep doing the fine-tuning masking. But again, I'm trying to be as sharp or as blurry as the base photograph. Now, I've done some really rough masking in here to sort of separate out the arm from the backgrounds. So if I Option click on that mask, then I can see just that mask, and this actually can make it quite a bit easier to erase it. So I'll go to my brush tool, I'll go ahead and toggle that black and white, and then I'm just going to really quickly kind of erase out these negative spaces. So this can just save you time if you block out kind of roughly where the edges are. Now again, if this were a different quality of photograph, I'd have to be a lot more precise with it. But in this case, because there's not a lot of detail in these photographs, because they're so grainy, I don't really need to worry about it a whole lot. So then once I get to something like that, I can just use my lasso tool and get rid of that. Except toggle my black and my white. So again, every time I'm toggling, I'm just hitting X on my keyboard to toggle the black and white. All right, so that's probably about as precise as I need to go. I probably don't need to be better than that. And here you can see, actually, if anything, those edges are too bright still. So I can pull that down, and then I'm going to go ahead and place her and the children sort of a little bit off the bottom of the screen. And then if I zoom in, one other thing I can do is you'll notice she has a little bit of a light halo there. If that really bothers me, what I can do is come back in and make a new layer above all these. And I'll make this like clipping mask. So I'll do Control click, create clipping mask just in case. And I can actually sample a color, sort of a mid-tone, and just kind of draw over that a little bit. So I'm drawing over those dark edges, and I'll set this to multiply. Oops, sorry, I'll set the blending mode to multiply. So now it's a little bit too dark, so I can set this to darken. And then I can also blur that edge. So I can go to Blur, Gaussian Blur, and just, I don't need to blur quite that much, but just enough so that it softens that edge. So if you have like a little halo like that, and you just want to quickly soften it, you can just draw over it, set it to darken or multiply, blur it a little bit, and that does that work for you. So here, I'll just go through and do a little bit more. And it's coming up too dark now because I set my brush to multiply, so I want my brush to be set to normal. I don't want to go too dark. There we go. And you can do the same thing, by the way, with lighten. So he's got this sort of hard edge right here. I can make another layer, set this to clipping mask, create clipping mask. I can sample a lighter color and just sort of draw over that edge just a little bit. And I can blur it. So I'll go back to Gaussian blur because I might want to reset that. So that's the original. That's just a little bit blurred. And actually, I don't need to change anything with that. That looks fine. But I could, if I wanted to, play around with screen or lighten. But actually, normal looks just fine, I think. I'll set it at screen though. All right, so those are just some quick ways. You can actually burn and dodge the source photograph, but that's a destructive change. So whenever you can use clipping masks and adjustment layers, it's a better way to go. But I probably didn't need to do that because this image is pretty grainy. Now, once I have all that, I might decide that I need to adjust that hue and saturation a little bit more. She actually looks a little bit too blue still. So I'll go ahead and double click on that hue and saturation. And I'm going to go ahead and just sort of try to adjust that value just a little bit to make it a little bit warmer. And if you can't tell like if it's what direction it's going, this saturation is set to -65. So I'll just pull this way up and then I can go down and sort of try to experiment with what's going to give me a slightly warmer tone. Then I can go back to -65. And it's still a little bit blue, so I'll go ahead and just pull that saturation back up again, just a hair. Okay, so the mom and the boy look pretty good, but the girl is almost a little bit too blue now. So if I toggle that on and off, you can see that's actually a better tone for her. So what I'm going to do is grab my brush, and I have the opacity or the hardness set really low, it's 0, and I've just pulled down the opacity to about 24, and I'm going to make some light passes on her on that mask. So I have the mask for hue and saturation selected. So when I'm painting into it, I'm basically going back to this original state. So I'm just going to do some light passes on her, a little bit on her mom, just on the side there. And if I do it a little bit too much, I can always hit X to toggle my black and white. I can pull this down even lower, and I can come back in and kind of bring back that mask a little bit. But now she's just a little bit warmer. So the mom and the boy are about the right value and the right saturation. No, she's just a little bit warmer, so she blends in better with that side. All right. Now we're going to go through and do that same process for the man. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure he's kind of where I want him to be. And I'll go ahead and add that mask to the whole group. And I'll go through and do that same process. Okay, so there he is. That looks about right. I'll go ahead and bring you back in that background and the woman and the kids. And I can see I can move him over a little bit. So I'll go ahead and move him over this way. Kind of want him to be at this anchored about this third. And I can decide if I want to move him up a little bit. I'll go ahead and do that, and then I'll do a little bit more masking. And then finally, now that that masking is done, I want to zoom out a little bit more and just sort of decide if his color looks about right. So again, I'll come back in and check out the levels and the hue and saturation. Remember, he was a trickier one. It looks pretty good. The levels look a little bright still on those rocks. So what I might do in this case is I might actually add another levels to darken the rocks, but I'm going to leave him about where he is. So I'm going to go ahead and do another levels, and I'll make this a clipping mask, and I'm just going to make those rocks a little bit darker, and yeah, probably that. Actually, I might even pull up the value. I kind of want to adjust the midtones for the rocks is what it really is. So I'll do something like that. There we go. All right, so I've gotten the rocks about where I want them, but of course that makes him way too dark. So what I can do again is come into that mask and just get rid of the areas where I want it to be how it was before. So I'll go to B to my brush. I'm going to pull up the opacity all the way in this case. I'll toggle my black and my white. And I'm just going to go ahead and bring him back kind of how he was before. And I'll make this a little bit lighter. And now I'll go ahead and pull that opacity in. So, because I want to fade it a little bit on these rocks and the boxes in his pants. I don't want it to be too abrupt. There we go. So that actually worked pretty well. So that's just adding a little bit of a darkening to the rocks. And I think that works pretty good for him. All right, so I'm pretty much done with this. The last thing I really want to do is add in the text that's going to get animated. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my text tool and type in 1906 earthquake. Actually, let's just do 1906. Let's leave it at that for now. So I'm going to go ahead and make this quite a bit bigger. And I'll go ahead and scale it up because this is text, it's basically a vector layer. And I'm going to go ahead and change that color to be sampled from that background. All right. And I need to decide what kind of font I want for this. So just like before, you normally want to go and to search out some fonts. I'm going to go ahead and show you some techniques for finding better fonts and then using them for your project. When choosing fonts, you really have to start off with some research. So in this case, I'm looking at turn of the century fonts. This is sort of Victorian, but I was also looking at Edwardian period fonts. You can see that there's some common themes and styles. If it feels like it's kind of like the Wild West or Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus kind of fonts, that's for a historic reason. So at any rate, this gives me a sense of the direction that I need to go, and further research would actually help that even more. But there's two good websites that I'd recommend going to when you're just trying to figure out kind of what fonts to use as placeholders. One is duffont.com and the other is 1001freefonts.com. Both of these have basically open source fonts. The licensing varies from one to another. So these, for instance, are free for personal use. Sometimes you'll see ones, let me see if I can find some that are 100% free. So you'll find different types of font styles. This is a demo one. So you can use them in different capacities. Generally speaking, if you need to use it for commercial application or even for your portfolio, I'd recommend going ahead and buying the font that you end up wanting to use. And fonts are generally pretty cheap. You know, a really expensive font might be only $30 or $40, depending on how many different variations on the font you want. So at any rate, what I've done is I've sort of narrowed down these searches to Western. So basically, when we think about 1906 in San Francisco, we're also kind of talking about the West, right? You know, the Wild West, as it were, or the myth of that anyway. So I typed in 1906 San Francisco in my preview, and then I can go through and sort of look at these different fonts and kind of evaluate which ones might be the best bet and which ones are nearer and farther. So one thing we want to think about is legibility. I'll go ahead and download this one. You can see some of them, they give you the option of donating to the designer. And I'll go ahead and download a couple of different fonts. All right, after I've downloaded those fonts, I can go ahead and install them on my computer. Now, depending on whether you're using a Mac or a PC, this process might be different. So on my Mac, I just double click on it and I say install font. And it'll usually tell me if there's some sort of problem. Sometimes it's because I already have the font installed, but I go ahead and install it anyway. So go ahead and install the fonts that you've downloaded. And one thing to note is that sometimes when you download a font, it'll have a README text, which gives you a little bit more information about it. So if you did decide to purchase it, you could go to these websites and purchase it directly. Back in Photoshop, I can take this font then and test out some of those new fonts that I just downloaded. So if I just start typing in Young, I get this Young Heart Regular, which is one of those fonts that I downloaded. I'll go ahead and make this a little bit bigger just so I can kind of see what's happening. And I might decide that I need to change the color just so I can kind of compare and contrast a little bit easier. So I'll go ahead and make this sort of a warmer cast, something maybe like that. There we go. Okay, that's a horrible vibrating font, but we'll go ahead and choose that for now. And what I can do is I can duplicate this text a couple times to sort of compare different font options. So again, we want to think about legibility and what that means for these different font types. So I'll go ahead and just try a couple different fonts. I have to remember what they were called. So Wild Rodeo was one, so I'll go ahead and just start typing in Wild. And there's that Wild Rodeo. And then another one was Lost Saloon. So I'll just start typing in, let me get the right one. Lost Saloon. And as I go through, I can sort of decide which is going to be, a little easier or harder to read. I think the other one I grabbed was Quentin Caps. So I'll type in Quentin Caps. And I can sort of decide, which of these is going to make the most sense. Now, depending on the font, you might want to make it a raster image, or you might want to decide that you're going to, do some work on have a raster version and a vector version. So sometimes it helps to have just a couple different versions of a font in a scene and then decide what's going to work best for your animation. I do like the negative spaces in these letters, but something like this is going to be really complex. So I think I'm probably not going to use this bottom one. So I'll delete that guy. This one is the Wild Rodeo, so I'll just change that name to Wild Rodeo. And then this one was called Young Heart, so I'll change that name to Young Heart. And when I get into animating it, I can sort of make a decision then about which one I want to use. So I'll just put them both there for now. And now I'm going to save a new copy of this where I have these layers merged. Because remember, I don't want to have all those nested folders. When you have a folder in Photoshop, if you import this into After Effects, it will import these folders as nested compositions. This can be incredibly helpful and powerful for a lot of circumstances. But in this case, we don't need that. We just need those individual layers. So I'm going to go ahead and go to File, Save As. I'm going to save it in that same folder, that same graphics folder, and I'm going to call it 1906 Merged, just so I know that this is one with merged layers. So remember, you always want to have one copy that has the original. Now I'll go ahead and control-click on this whole group, and I'll say Merge Group. And then I'll do the same thing with the woman and child, Merge Group, and then finally with the background, Merge Group. So now that I have all three of these layers merged and I don't really need to do anything else with them, I've got my two fonts. Now it's ready to be brought into After Effects.